Good morning.
Good morning.
Peace be with each one of you.
Your spirit.
Almighty Father, incline thine ear. Bless us and all those who gather here. Thine angels send us, who shall defend us, and fill with grace all who dwell in this place. Amen. I'm grateful to Lincoln and to all of you in the National Catholic Education Association for inviting me to speak to you at your leadership summit. The work of the National Catholic Education Association is very important to the Catholic Church in the United States, and certainly very important to those of us who serve the Church as bishops. And I applaud the principals as well as the superintendent of schools who do so much work. Most of you here are superintendents, but Lincoln told me that many principals are a part of this by way of Zoom and other electronic media. Without good superintendents of schools and good principals, the work of Catholic education is doomed to failure. This morning, I have been asked to speak to you about a particular challenge that all of those involved in Catholic education face, namely how Catholic schools can play a needed role in bridging the racial divide in the United States and in the Catholic Church in the United States. I believe all of you have an outline that was sent to you, at least electronically, and with that you should be able to follow the direction of my remarks, but I may modify them at some point depending on the time. So let us begin. In 1979, the bishops of the United States issued a pastoral letter which we called Brothers and Sisters to Us. The letter condemned racism as a sin and a heresy, which endures in American society and endures in the Catholic Church. I reviewed this draft for then Bishop Hickey in Cleveland and for Bishop Joseph Francis, the auxiliary bishop of Newark. Many years later, Bishop Francis told me about a time when he gave a talk to a large conference on Catholic education. And someone at the conference stood up and said, "Bishop, when I think of how much the Catholic Church has done for African American people, I cannot help but to wonder how there can be so few African American Catholics." Bishop Francis wryly responded, "Well, if you have seen and heard what I have seen and heard, you would not be wondering how there can be so few Black Catholics. You would be wondering, how can there be so many?" Sadly, Bishop Francis said the Catholic Church has been on the wrong side of history when it comes to the question of race in this country. He then asked the questioner if the questioner had read Brothers and Sisters to Us. The questioner said, "I never heard of it." The bishop said, "This is a failure of education on the part of the church. If this pastoral letter had been on the sin and heresy of abortion, the questioner certainly would have heard of it and certainly would have read it. But a pastoral letter on the racial divide was then as now the best kept secret in the Catholic Church." In November 2018, we bishops published Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, a pastoral letter against racism, which urged all Catholics to acknowledge the scourge of racism that still exists in our hearts, our words, our actions, and our institutions. It said racism can be individual when Catholics fail to recognize people of a particular race as created in the image of God and equal in dignity. It can also be systemic when practices, policies, and entire social economic, and political structures perpetuate the subjugation and unjust treatment of people because of their race. If our dear Bishop Joseph Francis were here, he would ask, how many American Catholics have read Open Wide Our Hearts? How many pastors have preached on Open Wide Our Hearts? How many small groups in parishes have discussed it? How many Catholic superintendents of schools have read it carefully and discussed it with their principals? How many have established committees in their schools and in their dioceses to implement the recommendations of Open Wide Our Hearts? How many students in our Catholic schools, especially at the secondary level, have studied this critical document? Bishop Francis would say, probably not many. Probably not many. And this is a failure of education. He often said the Catholic Church does not need to say more or write more. What the Catholic Church needs to do is do more and be more. So our reflections will take us on a moving viewpoint as we discuss Christian wisdom, the racial divide. Most Americans are not racist. There are no minority Americans. Afrocentric religious thoughts from the Catholic Church, critical race theory, and some concluding comments on resources and suggestions. So we reflect together on the racial divide in the United States, especially as it pertains to the Catholic Church, as it pertains to the challenges of our Catholic schools, in a particular way, our elementary and our secondary schools. We need to remind ourselves of this key point. If someone asked you, what is the reason why the Church has established Catholic elementary schools and secondary schools, can I say colleges and universities? That's a subject for another day. These exist for one reason: to inform, form, and transform our young people in Jesus Christ. That's why our schools exist. Not for the best sports teams, not for the best debating teams, not for the best bands or the best acting troops, but to inform, form, and transform young people in Jesus Christ and guide them on the path to Christian wisdom. If we do not do this, there is no hope of bridging the racial divide. Indeed, it is Christian wisdom that anchors their faith, making it clear that our schools are not private schools, not an escape from the public schools. Our schools are Christian schools, whose primary goal is to help our students to attain the joyful vision of life that comes from Christian wisdom. Everyone involved in any aspect of our school systems, beginning with the superintendent of schools, should be committed to cultivating Christian wisdom. However, Christian wisdom can only come about if students and teachers alike strive to learn their faith, to love their faith, to live their faith. This trio is essential. In Catholic schools, superintendents of schools, principals, teachers, and students alike must be committed to learn their faith, love their faith, and live their faith. If not, there is no hope of bridging the racial divide. Christian wisdom means developing a personal relationship with Jesus of Nazareth through scripture, prayer, the sacraments, and living in a school environment that is actually, truly a Christian community. Christian wisdom makes it possible for the children in our schools to know how the greatest story ever told applies to the story that they are telling with their own personal lives day after day. Of course, parents play an essential role in the cultivation of Christian wisdom. Their children should be well on the path to Christian wisdom when they bring them to the door of our Catholic schools. Their homes should be a domestic or household church. Yet, we all know that this is not the case with the homes of many of our children. Parents expect the schools to form their children in Christian wisdom with no help whatsoever from them. This is a particular challenge for every principal and every superintendent of schools. Some parents seem to think that they simply drop their children off at the school and all religious formation is in the hands of the school or the parish school of religion. This attitude is doomed to failure. Without parents as cooperators with principals and superintendents of school and parish priests, these young people will not learn their faith, they will not love their faith, and they will not live their faith. And sadly, the absence of the involvement of parents in the spiritual formation of their children seems to be increasing. We know this from the simple fact that on Sundays, many of the parents of the children in our school are not at Mass. They do not pray at home. They do not read the scriptures. Some parents drop their children off for the parish school of religion when they could go to Mass while their children are at the parish school of religion. They go home and someone else brings them home after their time at the parish school of religion. This is a critical reality. And we bishops are very aware of the fact that as the number of Catholics participating regularly in the Eucharist declines more and more, perhaps even more so since the pandemic, the hope of forming our young people in Christian wisdom declines along with it. So we want to underscore this foundational issue. We want to truly bridge the racial divide in the church and in the United States. As Catholic educators and superintendents of schools, we must creatively look for ways to re-engage parents in their first commitment. After all, when their children are baptized, the priest during the baptism says, "You've been called to be the first teachers of your children in their faith." But many of our parents do not seem to take this seriously. The racial divide in the United States. Today, many individuals and groups in the media commonly use the word racism and racist to cover a wide range of expressions of racial bias, from disrespectful language to the terrible tragedy of the enslavement of free human beings. I distinguish between racism, which is the most grievous of all sins in terms of race, and racial bias, prejudice, or ignorance. So I use the broader expression, the racial divide, partially because the word racist and racism is already changed with so many emotions and so many feelings that the conversation almost cannot take place. I know an occasion where someone gave a talk to a group of well-meaning parents and teachers, and the first sentence was, "Whether you know it or not, you're all a bunch of white racists." Well, the conversation is over. Some of them may or may not be, but such a statement does not invite dialogue or conversation. It creates tension, it feels like an insult, and it seems to be a prejudging of individuals. So I distinguish between the broader reality, the racial divide, that in its extreme form is expressed in the horrible reality of racism, and in other circumstances may simply be expressions of bias or prejudice. All of us have biases, whether we know it or not. We all have biases. I just don't like those people. I don't really care for those people. I don't like their food. I don't like their music, whoever those people may be. That's a fault. That's a flaw. That's an imperfection. That's a lack of growth that needs to be addressed. But if one goes no further than these acts of bias and personal taste, while it's certainly not a sign of a mature human being, one need not necessarily be a racist. If someone simply says, "Well, you know, I don't really know any Japanese people, I don't think I would like them." Well, that's a person who needs to grow up. But if they're not out to harm Japanese people, to hurt Japanese people, or insulting Japanese people, or worse, physically doing them harm, ought one to call them a racist? If we're not careful, we'll have to say every human being in this country is a racist. Everybody. Because almost everybody has an unconscious feeling or attitude of dislike or ill-at-easeness with some group of people. It's built into the human condition. It's built into our educational background and our socialization. Now, I say this being very aware of the fact that racism in its worst form, including systemic racism, exists deeply in American society and deeply in the Catholic Church. But acknowledging that is not the same as saying that every human being is a racist. The racial divide has a long history, going back to 1619, when people began to bring human beings from West Africa to the coast of this country to be enslaved laborers in the plantations, the economic system that drove the wealth of this country. If you've not read Edward Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, your eyes would be opened by reading Baptiste's remarkable book. The half has never been told. The whole reality of enslaving human beings was primarily based on money. And to this day, the consequences of that enslavement, the social injustices that endure, are primarily based on money, making the rich richer. One of the worst examples of the racial divide as racism, of course, was the post-Civil War 1857 Dred Scott decision, the pre-Civil War 1857 Dred Scott decision, saying that Dred Scott and people of African background have no standing in the court. The Supreme Court ruled that people of African background are not human beings, but property. This is at the foundation of the racial divide that endures in this country, a judgment by the court that they are property of no more value than your horse, your dog, your cow, or your barn. But, and you may not know this, sadly, this opinion was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, a devout Roman Catholic, who himself owned enslaved free human beings. Chief Justice Taney's faith in Jesus Christ somehow did not open his eyes to the dignity and the worth of every human being. This unjust divide continued, of course, through the Jim Crow laws and all of their consequences that have a place in our culture to this day, and continue to reinforce economic and social differences for people of color and the rest of the country. And of course, the racial divide has become more acute in recent years with conflict between young men of color and representatives of law enforcement, dramatized in a particular way with the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and of course, the horrible events leading to the death of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis. When we acknowledge the fact that there is a distinction between racism and the racial divide, biases and prejudices, some people suggest, well, Bishop, you're letting white people off the hook. You're saying that they may be prejudiced or biased in some way, but they're not racist. You notice my point number C is most Americans are not racist. Well, often when I've spoken just on this topic, people have said, are you kidding? That should be changed to most Americans are racist, or at best, aren't most Americans racist? This is not an easy question. I know for a fact many American people who at least do not think that they are racist, they do not feel that they are racist, they don't think that they do or say things that make them racist. But critics of the statement, most Americans are not racist, must suggest that whether they think about it or not, they are the heirs to a whole social system that gives them white privilege and reinforces ideas of white supremacy. So they live in a racist structure, whether they personally embrace it or not. I still would argue, however, that most Americans and most American Catholics are not racist in the strict sense that I use it, of an open, active, overt hatred, dislike, wishing ill on people of different racial backgrounds. Does it mean that there are not many Americans, American Catholics, who have biases and prejudices? But I use racism in a stronger sense that is exemplified in some of the horrible things that we see in the news, sadly, almost every day. Still, people who have these biases in their heart may do very little to uproot these attitudes. And these flaws, these faults, this moral flaw can lead to the great moral evil and the moral sin of racism. If someone goes from just a vague sense of ill-at-easeness or uncomfortableness or a vague dislike of people of a different background and allow themselves to be influenced by things being said in the media or by things that they read or things that they see online, this can lead to open hostility, open hatred, and a willingness to harm. Obviously, when that happens, we're dealing not with mere racial bias, but racism itself. We must remind ourselves that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, well-meaning people who do not explicitly perpetuate racism contribute tacitly to the reality of racism by their silence. Well-meaning people, and this is a key idea from Dr. King and those who followed him, they don't explicitly articulate racism. They don't support the Ku Klux Klan. They don't support Confederate flags. They don't call people horrible names. They don't discriminate in their hiring practices, etc. But by their very silence, they are tacitly contributing to it because they don't see the structures around them that are benefiting from racist biases that they are not challenging and confronting. Those who live each day oblivious of the biases, prejudices, and racial stereotypes that influence them, they never speak, as I say, in a crude way against people, but they are the beneficiaries of so many unattended structures that have an impact on American society, including the church. It is not by chance, for example, that most Catholic parishes and most Catholic schools are, to this day, racially segregated. This is due in part to the fact, as Bishop Francis said, the Catholic Church was largely on the wrong side of history from the very beginning of the racial divide. Our Catholic schools are racially segregated because our neighborhoods are racially segregated. Our public schools are segregated as much now as they were before the Brown decision, the Supreme Court in 1954, in spite of the initial progress after that great decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. And of course, our public schools are advanced based on the tax base. So if people live in a wealthy suburban area and have a large tax base, they have the money for the best possible schools. This is something that is never addressed in a serious way in this country. We cannot improve education in our public school system as long as it is based on this tax system where the wealthy, usually those who are not people of color, have the largest amount of money to put into the tax pool. And this will continue to be a challenge as we move forward. The whole process in the 1960s of trying to resolve the racial divide by busing children from one school to another was a tacit acknowledgement of that fact. Why were they busing the schools to another area? Because the better schools are in that area. The only way for the children to benefit is to put them on buses and take them across town. And sometimes parents of all backgrounds were uncomfortable with their children being bused across town when they want them to be able to walk to the nearby neighborhood school. So I would like you to spend some time amongst yourselves thinking about the distinction between the racial divide and racism, between racial biases and prejudices and all-out overt racism, whether you think this distinction is helpful for you in your work as superintendents of school. The next point is equally challenging. There are no minority Americans. There are no minority Catholics. Last year, I read an article about Catholic education that said Catholic schools must strive to increase minority enrollment in order to ensure that high-quality educational opportunity is available to all students. You may not see a problem in this statement, but I do. I do. Why say we wish to increase our minority enrollment? Do you think this is neutral language? Why not say we need to increase our enrollment of African American students, Latino American students, Asian American students, Indigenous people, disabled Americans, whatever group we actually mean? Are there really minority Americans? It does not take a particularly critical analysis to recognize the fact that words like minorities and minority group are used quite selectively in American society, and they are not applied consistently in reference to all groups, ethnic groups that make up a statistically small number of citizens. There is no single ethnic, racial, or cultural group that constitutes true Americans. Every citizen of the United States is fully and equally an American in the exact same sense of the word, if he or she is a citizen. A careful reflection on the meaning of the expression "a pluribus unum," from many one, excludes the possibility of designating minorities in this country unless all citizens are called minorities. Obviously, this truth is not acknowledged by most sectors of American society. The Catholic Church, the New York Times, the Washington Post, many newspapers, cable news stations regularly speak about minorities. European Americans with roots in Ireland, Germany, Italy, or Poland, for example, were once ostracized in this country as immigrant foreigners and undesirable minorities. The same was true of Jewish people. But why are these groups not usually considered minorities today? What has changed? The answer is not because any one of these groups somehow constitutes the statistical majority of the American population. As Matthew Fry Jacobson's book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race notes, the process of gathering those Americans whose ancestors were from various European countries with little in common, indeed those who were once enemies, and making them into white people, the majority group, and relegating everyone else as minorities, is historically a rather recent and arbitrary development. Majority-minority language is not neutral language. It controls meaning and the way people perceive themselves in social context. It gives one group the vantage point of power from which they can brand other people negatively in their identity, speaking of other people not as who they are, but who they are not. Read Noel Ignatiev's book, How the Irish Became White. It is an eye-opener. How the Irish Became White. It is an eye-opener. You will note, obviously, that people from Sweden, Swedish Americans, are a small part of the American population. But when did you ever hear Swedish Americans referred to as a minority group? Why not? The answer is simple. They are part of an artificial conglomerate called white people, created as a political structure as people of color advance in numbers, especially in northern cities. As a Catholic bishop, I am very aware of the fact that many of my friends who are Protestant Christians rightly insist that Catholic Christians stop referring to them as what they are not and to refer to them as what they are. I refer to my sisters and brothers of other Christian traditions as just that, Christians of other traditions. Why do Catholics refer to them as non-Catholics? This is the language of power, willingly or not. This is the language of power. What are you? You're not what we are. You're a non-Catholic. You're a non-Catholic. No one ever calls a Catholic a non-Presbyterian or a non-Baptist or a non-Lutheran. Why is that? Language is used to control meaning. Now, As superintendent of schools, I wonder how easy it would be for you to broach this question in your diocese, your principals, in your school system with others, the question of majority-minority language. Are you willing to challenge this commonly accepted practice? Are you willing to study it more deeply and to see the truth of what I'm saying? How can we relegate some people into a situation of branding them as what they are not, instead of acknowledging what they are? Move on. Afrocentric religious art in Catholic churches. This is a tough one. How many of you have ever noticed the invisibility of people of color in Catholic religious art? How many of you have ever noticed it? Think of your own parish church. Look around the walls in your imagination. What's in the windows? What's on the ceiling? Whose statues are in the pedestals? Many years ago, I took a group of African-American Protestant children studying in a Catholic school to visit a Catholic church where I could explain the role of art in Catholic worship. We enter the church, and the curious children see all images of the sacred in Eurocentric art. All images of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, all the saints and angels are painted as Europeans. God the Father himself is a distinguished older white gentleman with blue eyes and a flowing white beard. An eighth grader said, if God is a spirit with no race or nationality, why is God pictured as an elderly white man? As he and other children looked at all the images in the church, they asked, does the Catholic Church believe that only white people are in heaven? These were little children. Looking at the statues, looking at the windows, they drew a logical conclusion. They saw nobody who looked like them. Does the Catholic Church believe that only white people are in heaven? One girl asked if angels have no bodies, no gender, if they are spirits, why are they all pictured with blonde-haired, blue-eyed, rosy cheeks? Couldn't there be at least one angel to represent other races? Couldn't the church at least have a statue of a strong angel who looked like a great African-American athlete? Another asked, why are there no Black, Asian, or Hispanic saints in the church windows? And later I discussed this experience with the teachers. They asked, wouldn't the Catholic Church be more welcoming of all people if the holy men and women were pictured as people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds? After all, though we know that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were Jewish, we don't really know what they look like. We don't know that Jesus was tall and blue-eyed with a beard and long hair. The Shroud of Turin notwithstanding, we don't know what Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like. Wouldn't it be a small gesture of aesthetic diversity and a powerful asset in evangelization if the church were to be more diverse in its religious art? Several teachers asked if the Catholic Church would ever depict racially diverse diversity in its churches, and if not, why not? Well, the answer is in the facts. Every year, new Catholic churches are dedicated and loudly proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is reserved for white people only, because those are the only people ever painted on the walls and the statues and the windows of churches, even the one that was most recently built yesterday, or dedicated last week. After all these years of debate and discussion about the racial divide, that small change has not been possible and probably will not be possible. Some people ask, why are there so few African American Catholics? Why are there so many? What do you think of this challenge, this problem, the invisibility of people of color in Roman Catholic religious art? Is this a topic you could bring up to principals, to pastors, to diocesan organizers, to the bishop? Even in Catholic schools where there is some diversity of African American students, or more likely Latino students, even there, when you visit the schools, you might still see all the statues, and all the crucifixes, and all the artwork is Eurocentric. As one person said to me many years ago, but Bishop, you're not really saying that you think that God is not white. An interesting question. An interesting question. If God is absolute goodness, truth, and beauty, if God is pure spirit, ultimately God has no nationality, no race, no gender. God is simply God, dwelling in unapproachable light. Moving on, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, why? Because all lives matter. If the Catholic Church cannot make the small step of diversity in its iconography, it might be understandable if African Americans feel they do not matter to the Catholic Church. If we cannot even put one image of a person of color in a church, why would Black Catholics feel that they matter? Of course, as Christians, we say we believe that all lives matter. And if all lives matter, certainly Black lives matter, in spite of all the overtones that come from the public debate and disputes and the various protests and dramatic instances that we've been facing in recent years. It's a basic truth. As Christians, if we believe all lives matter, that means all lives matter. People of every race, every nationality, every religion, every sexual orientation, all lives matter. And I do not think that Black Lives Matter and all lives matter are incompatible. All lives matter, however, is sometimes used as a way to divert attention from the urgent concerns of African American people. For there to be a true compatibility between all lives matter and Black Lives Matter, it is necessary to acknowledge the legitimacy of the existential crisis that many African Americans are experiencing in this country, and to acknowledge that their situation is urgent. Let's use an example. Let's say you are secure in your comfortable home, your family, on a cold winter's night, you had a good dinner, the fireplace is burning, more than enough to eat. Your family members certainly matter to you. But let's say the doorbell rings. The doorbell rings and there's a shivering, starving, homeless African-American family at the door in dire need of food and shelter. And you tell them, well, there's a shelter about 6 miles down the road. Go there and they might be able to help you. They respond, but our lives matter. And you say, but my life and my family's life matter. We matter too. But maybe, just maybe, looking into the eyes of this needy mother and father and their small children, maybe in that moment you realize, in that critical moment, it is their lives that are in peril. They're the ones who are desperately in need, not you and not your family. And it's because their lives are in peril that their lives matter in a different way, not more, but in a different way because of the existential crisis that they find themselves in. If you simply say all lives matter, there's a danger of falsely implying that every group of Americans is facing the same degree of peril, which then makes it possible to ignore or deny pressing obvious inequities in our country. Aggrieved individuals and groups feel that those who say all lives matter do not really mean it. Some point to George Orwell's novella, Animal Farm, which is probably familiar to you. In Animal Farm, the mantra, all animals are equal. All animals are equal. Gradually became, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Some animals are more equal than others. Orwell is making a point that is as timely as the morning paper. The point of Black Lives Matter is that many in the African American community face an existential threat that really should not and cannot be ignored, particularly by the Catholic Church, which proclaims that in Jesus Christ we're all redeemed, we're all saved by the blood of the Lord, which proclaims that Christ has come to redeem us all and to announce the good news that we're all children of the one God, that we're all sisters and brothers to one another and to Christ himself. Give some thought to your feelings and the discussions you may have had with your family, with your principals or your colleagues about the debate on the phrase Black Lives Matter. We know it's tinged with all kinds of emotion. We know that depending on whether you're watching CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, or whatever radio stations you're listening to, you'll get a completely different idea about Black Lives Matter. But what do you think? What do you think? And ask yourself in your lived life, what kinds of contact do you, as superintendents of school, have with people of color? How many of you have friends with people of color? How many of you go out to dinner with people of color? How many of you have gone on vacation with people of color? How many of you share the major truths of your soul space with people of color? We cannot really grasp that people's lives matter if we do not know them. If we do not know them, we don't have any kind of personal rapport with them. This is a topic worthy of your discussion as superintendent of schools, and certainly I would hope.
Students, if you would enter the auditorium for reading through the side doors only. Juniors and seniors, if you would go through the fine arts hallway, freshmen and sophomores to the student services hallway. Please enter reading through the side doors only today. Thank you.
I would certainly hope that in your conversations, you will open your minds and hearts to the positive aspect of the phrase Black Lives Matter, allowing for the fact that sometimes it is used in a way that is not productive and simply adds to conflict and division. Let us turn now to a difficult topic, critical race theory. It is a difficult topic. In many ways, there's an unnecessary controversy surrounding critical race theory. In some ways, for you as superintendents of school and for your principals, it might be unwise to engage in any public discussion about critical race theory because it is so volatile. Nevertheless, there may be circumstances where you have no choice but to address the question of critical race theory. Certainly, at least in my judgment, there is no reason for Catholic educators to speak about critical race theory in the classrooms of elementary school students or secondary school students. Unfortunately, some principals might be unable to avoid doing so because in certain situations, if teachers simply mention racial prejudice, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, the death of Mr. George Floyd, Confederate monuments, and the like, some will immediately say, aha, that teacher's bringing up critical race theory. We want that teacher out of our school. School boards will go berserk. They're talking about critical race theory. Some anchors on some news channels say, did you know that this Catholic school, they're teaching critical race theory? The simple mention of sociological realities has come to be called critical race theory, which they are not. The place for discussing and debating critical race theory is at the graduate level of a university class in sociology, politics, social justice, and the history of race relations in this country. Because it is born from the university, like many ideas born from the university, critical race theory is not easy to define. And therefore, it is easy for the popular media and the general public to misunderstand it altogether. I was appointed to the faculty of Harvard Divinity School in 1976, just as critical race theory was emerging at Harvard due to Professor Derek Bell's 1973 book, Race, Racism, and American Law. Students at Harvard Law School organized protests regarding Harvard's lack of racial diversity in the curriculum among students and in the faculty. Very little diversity amongst those who taught them, and very little diversity in the student body. The students supported Professor Derek Bell, who resigned his position at Harvard because of what he viewed as the university's discriminatory practices. During his time at Harvard Law, Dr. Bell had developed a new course that studied American law through the lens of race. He started studying American law through the lens of race. It was called critical law theory, looking at law through the lens of race. Harvard students of color wanted the faculty to be made up of color, to teach new courses since Dr. Bell was gone. The university rejected this request. Therefore, the students got together and boycotted the regular law schools and developed an alternative course using Bell's book as a core text. Critical race theory developed as a body of legal scholarship as an academic movement of United States civil rights scholars and activists seeking to examine critically the intersection of race and US law and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. Critical race theory examines social, cultural, and legal issues primarily as they relate to race and racism in the United States. Proponents of critical race theory argue that racism and its consequences are the result of complex, changing, and often subtle social institutional dynamics rather than explicit and intentional prejudice on the parts of individuals. Critical race theory is not altogether new. It builds on the scholarship of people like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and W.E.B. Du Bois. In March of 2012, just 5 months after Dr. Bell died, he became the target of conservative media, including Breitbart and Sean Hannity, in an expose that they were doing on President Barack Obama. The controversy focused on a 1990 video showing Mr. Obama praising Dr. Bell at a protest by Harvard Law students. As you know, the former president is a graduate of Harvard Law School. The protest over perceived lack of diversity in the school faculty. A careful examination of Mr. Obama's syllabus for his lectures on race and law at the University of Chicago revealed that he is significantly different from Professor Bell in his approach, even though Mr. Obama does draw on many writings of critical race theory in his lectures. But the very fact that he would draw on any of them in any way, even if he were to be critical of them, those during this expose saw that as an occasion to say, see, we told you so. We told you so. Now, critical race theory, or theorists, reject the philosophy of color blindness. They point out the stark racial disparities that have persisted in the United States even after decades of civil rights reform. They raise structural questions about how racist hierarchies are enforced even among people with good intention, even among people who think of themselves not as racist. As I was saying earlier, people say, well, I may have a few biases or prejudice, but I'm not a racist. Critical race theory argues with contemporary anthropology that the category race is a creation of society, not born of the biological reality of diverse skin color and facial features. This is a difficult subject into which we cannot go, but some of you probably know the most serious anthropologists argue that there's no anthropological basis for arguing or dividing the human family into different races, since from the point of view of our DNA and our basic structure, all people are 99.9% the same in spite of appearances. In more recent years, of course, we all know the debate concerning critical race theory has spilled far beyond the pages of academic discourse and far beyond the halls of academia. After the many protests over the killing of Mr. George Floyd, conversations about structural racism emerged in the United States at every level. Former President Donald Trump issued a memo to federal agencies that warned against critical race theory, labeling it as divisive, followed by an executive order barring any sensitivity training that suggested that the United States had any dimension or any structural racism or racial bias in its basic orientation. Later, President Biden's administration rescinded Mr. Trump's order. But by then, critical race theory had already been made into a kind of a wedge issue. So critical race theory is often used to describe activities that do not really fit the academic definition of critical race theory. So for some, just acknowledging that racial prejudice and racism exists in school lessons, or just the suggestion of some sensitivity training for faculty members or superintendents of school or principals, to some mean, aha, there you are, you're sneaking in critical race theory. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Even without using the word critical race theory, there are now a group of sort of critical race theory policemen and women, you might say, who say, I know you didn't say it, but you're talking about the things that we know are secretly suggesting that you are a proponent of critical race theory. When you take that approach, that means schools, elementary schools, high schools, Catholic schools, can't raise these questions at all for fear of being branded as proponents of critical race theory. Meanwhile, some more conservative lawmakers and activists have used the term critical race theory as a catch-all phrase for any examination of systemic racism. And this continues to this day. Well, there's a lot more that could be said about this problematic and difficult topic, critical race theory. All I've tried to do was to give you some background, perhaps that you may or may not be aware of, to help you when you're thinking about it. I will stop talking about it here with the reminder that while it is critical for Catholic educators and superintendents of schools and principals to be well informed about the topic of critical race theory, Catholic elementary and secondary school educators really should avoid the quagmire of bringing the debate concerning critical race theory into their classrooms or school board meetings. You cannot win. You cannot win. The situation is so intense at this point. If you just use the phrase, the conversation is over for those who are looking for someone to dare to raise the topic of critical race theory. And it doesn't belong in Catholic elementary school. It doesn't belong in Catholic secondary school. It's a university scholarly paradigm, a framework for looking at the complex reality of race and racial division in the United States. But while I think that it would be unwise for you to bring up critical race theory in any public gathering with school boards or teachers or parents, this does not mean that you as Catholic superintendents of school and principal have the right to shrink from your responsibility as disciples of Jesus Christ. And your responsibility as disciples of Jesus Christ means that you must clearly condemn the sin and the heresy of racism, white supremacy, and white privilege. Even though some may presume to say, aha, you're proposing critical race theory. You must do so with renewed diligence if there's any hope of bridging the racial divide in the United States. I'm aware we started late, but I'm also aware of where we are in our time. I plan to give you a list of resources that would be helpful that I gleaned from several sources, but I think I'm going to do something different under number H and just point out to you the fact that last night I saw a few minutes of MSNBC's documentary on the Civil War. Now, as soon as you say MSNBC, you know they have a bias. CNN has a bias. Fox News has a bias. We don't have any news channels anymore. They don't have a bias. So you need to keep that in mind. I didn't see all of it, but the approach they were taking might suggest that it could be a resource that you as superintendents of school could share with your principals, not necessarily with your students. You need to watch it yourself and see the whole of it and understand the debate about it before you make use of it. But it looked as if it was taking an approach to the past through the lens of the present that might be helpful for you as superintendents of school to carry on a dialogue about the racial divide in Catholic education. I don't recommend it, I simply point it out. I don't recommend it, I simply point it out. There's a difference. I hope that each one of you, as superintendents of school, will do all you can to try to model and support appropriate behavior in speech when addressing issues of race in our Catholic schools. Our students spontaneously absorb the attitudes and the vocabulary of the leaders around them. If teachers, parents, priests, coaches, dining room staff, school custodians, and others speak and act in ways that show respect and appreciation for people of different racial backgrounds, the children will notice it and imitate it. At the same time, if the children will notice even the smallest expression of prejudice, racial bias, and attitudes of racial superiority, a Catholic school, like a Catholic home or Catholic parish, is called by baptism to be a Christian community in every circumstance. Acknowledging and overcoming the racial divide is not something just for religion class or Mass on Sunday. The call to love our neighbor as we love ourselves must be heard in the school cafeteria, in the gymnasium, on the playground, in every classroom, in every faculty meeting, and in every circumstance, because there is no place in Catholic education where we are exempt from the call of Jesus Christ to love God with your whole heart and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. To conclude, dear sisters and brothers in Jesus Christ, as I said, it is a privilege for me to be with you as superintendents of school and to support you and to express gratitude for all you do in this difficult juncture as superintendents of Catholic schools, not of private schools, not of suburban schools, not of middle-class schools, not of white schools, Catholic schools that exist because of the mission of the Catholic Church. Go out and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And this is true even in schools where a number of the students are not Catholic, where numbers of the faculty members are not Catholic. They come to your faculty as Catholic, knowing it is a Catholic school. And you should not be embarrassed about the fact that it is a Catholic school, or feel defensive about it to faculty members who come of other faith backgrounds or no faith background. At the same time, of course, you want to be sensitive to and respectful of the background of those teachers who come from diverse circumstances. The work of Catholic schools and the work of principals and superintendents of schools and teachers in our Catholic schools can only bridge the racial divide, can only do so if there is a deep interior conversion of hearts. A conversion of hearts, I believe, that is only possible because of the power of the Holy Spirit. For Catholic schools to play a positive role in overcoming the racial divide in the Catholic Church and in the United States is in truth a high and distant goal. It is not something that you will succeed at in a week or a month or a year. There is no program, there's no handbook, there's no seminar, there's no small group discussion that will overcome this. This is deeply rooted in American society. This is deeply rooted in parts of the Catholic Church. I can tell you this from my own experience, into which I shall not go. The remarkable St. Teresa of Calcutta was faced with a high and distant goal when she addressed the enormous suffering and poverty in India. She was often told that she and her sisters were having no impact on the social, economic, and political structures in India that were the root cause of the suffering that moved her so deeply. So Mother Teresa, now Saint Teresa, quickly conceded to her critics that she and her sisters could not possibly have a major impact on such widespread, unspeakable pain and suffering. They cannot overcome India's long-standing caste system. They cannot overcome its political corruption. They cannot overcome its terrible poverty. They cannot provide food, housing, education, and employment for the vast numbers of people starving and literally dying on the streets of Calcutta every day. And I have seen this with my own eye when I visited Calcutta with a group of seminarians when I was at the North American College in Rome. She says, we cannot fix all of this, we know it. We may not be able to do a great deal to change the world around us, but every one of us as Catholics can do something, no matter how seemingly insignificant. She said, you are criticizing me because I cannot do everything. We are trying to do, and we feel compelled to do what we can. What are you doing? She asked her critics. We are doing what we can. What are you doing? And many of them, if they were honest, would have to say, we are doing nothing. Dear sisters and brothers in Christ, the same applies to you and the same applies to me. You cannot throw up your hands and say, well, the bishop gave a talk on the racial divide and systemic racism and the challenges the Catholic Church faces and the challenges of our Catholic school. There's no solution. There's nothing we can do. It is a high and distant goal, but it is still the goal. And every one of you, like St. Teresa, every one of you, all of us, are compelled to do what we can. For we are the hope of the church. We are the hope of the church. This much you must do. Follow these simple imperatives, which I've tried to live by for so many years. Listen, learn, think, pray, and act. In facing the racial divide in Catholic schools, follow these imperatives. Listen, learn, think, pray, and act. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk, and His Excellency has graciously allowed for about 30 minutes for questions and answers. And so we'd invite you to perhaps come and ask a question of.
Do they need a microphone so the question can be heard? Oh, you can hear me.
So I was going to propose that we stand here so the camera for our viewers at home would pick it up, and then hopefully
right.
be able to go from there. So
and you may ask any question or make any comment. Nothing surprises me. Nothing hurts my feeling. I have heard everything.
And Bishop, may I ask the first question? In your book, The Church and the Racial Divide, you talk about the tension between Black theology and classical Catholic theology. So I was hoping you might say a few words about how that might inform catechesis for us in Catholic schools.
Well, I do talk about that. And I didn't pick it up here because it's so complicated and needed a whole chapter. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the writings of people like James Cone, and his book on Black theology, or others who've written books with bold titles like Is God a White Racist? A strong group of African-American Protestant theologians in the last 20, 25 years or so have written a number of thought-provoking books that have become called Black theology or African-American theology, just as there's now a feminist theology and a liberation theology, theology that could be described as more being developed from below than from above. Much of theology is deductive. You start with God or Jesus or some philosophical idea that's abstract, and then you deduce concrete ideas. These types of existential theology are inductive. They start with what people are experiencing. What are women experiencing, especially those who are poor and oppressed? What are Latinos experiencing? What are African-American people experiencing? And from that, raising the question, what kind of God is a God who allows these things to happen? Is God really a God who fixes the world simply if you say enough prayers? Black theology has emerged as a very challenging critique of standard Western theology, pointing out that it is a fallacy to say that people like the great Paul Tillich, a great Protestant theologian, or Karl Barth, another Protestant theologian, that their theology is objective. Theology out of Europe, the United States, it comes out of Yale Divinity School, or Harvard Divinity School, or Princeton Divinity School, University of Chicago Divinity School. This is objective theology. But as soon as a person of color writes a book on theology from the point of view of the challenges facing people of color, well, they're not doing real theology. They're doing very subjective, personalized theology from the sufferings of a particular group of people. And while it might be informative to become aware of the oxalating crises that people are facing in the African-American community, real theology is philosophical, it's abstract. It discusses the mystery of the Trinity. It discusses the mystery of eternal life. It discusses how Jesus could be God incarnate. It discusses the possibility of the resurrection of the dead. Real theology stays in this very intellectual, from above plane and doesn't get into the messy situation of people's daily lives. James Combs and Otis Roberts and so many others dismissed all of this. And I knew James Combs very well before he died. And he asked me, when I'd already written a number of issues about African American Catholics, you ought to be the Catholic spokesperson for Black theology. I said, I don't think so, because I don't think that I have to speak in my own voice. And I pointed out, you can write the kinds of things that you write in part because Protestant theology is very comfortable confronting and even not only criticizing, but even overturning its tradition. Protestant theologians often are not uncomfortable saying what we taught in the past was wrong. In the Catholic tradition, because we have the magisterium of the Bishop of Rome, our Holy Father, the Pope, and the bishops collectively, who teach normatively on what the church holds and believes about questions of faith and moral, most theologians, while they might ask some questions about the tradition, unless they are really on the cutting edge, don't usually confront the tradition and say, what the church has always taught is wrong, and I'm telling you what you should be thinking now. Now, there are some writers who are more challenging than others. Some of you might know Father Brian Mazingale at Fordham, and I know Brian very well. He's very comfortable with a more, shall we say, confrontational approach in his theological writing. But I think it would be very hard for someone to write credible Black theology as a Catholic in the style of some of these Protestants. People like Sean Copeland and others. We were together in Notre Dame recently for a conference on a symposium on Black theology. She raises some very important questions. So there is a tension between what is called the new corpus of Black theology as articulated by African American Protestant theologians and how the Catholic voice can be raised. We need to bear in mind, of course, that in the United States, while there are 67 million Catholics on the books, not in church on Sunday, there are only about 2.9 million African American Catholics on the books, not in church on Sunday. And there are maybe with deaths and retirement, there may be removals from ministry, there may be 45,000 priests in the United States, down from 60 to 70,000. There may be, but there are fewer than 250 African American priests. And many of them, because of their age and public background, are not involved in the academy. So the possibility of voices being raised from within the church to articulate an African American Catholic theology is somewhat limited because the pool is small. And most of these priests, of course, are very much involved in pastoral ministry, just like most bishops. Most bishops do not write books except for devotional books or books about things related to their parish life. They don't write a book like the one that you raised, my book on racial divide. So that's just a comment about that. It's not a simple subject.
Bishop, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Tell me who you are and where you're from.
I'm Dave Faber, Superintendent of the Diocese of Grand Rapids. I am wondering, we as educators have all heard the research about if a young person has a teacher that looks like themselves, especially our students of color, that they're more than 2 times likely to graduate and so on and so forth. With so few Black Catholics, what is your feeling about hiring Christians of other faith traditions to teach in Catholic schools?
Well, you asked a question which I've heard many times and for which there is no simple answer. Obviously, there is certainly truth to the research that people are influenced. I see leaders who look like them, whether it's policemen and women, firemen and women, and the same problem. This is the pool of people who might become firemen and women in a big city like Chicago or Boston or New York is small, especially from certain communities who don't necessarily want to be policemen, especially because of what they perceive the police force to be like. But would it be helpful? Obviously, it would be if we had more teachers in our Catholic schools who were people of Hispanic background and African American background, and other groups as well, Asian American, etc. It would be very helpful. But the pool would be very small, And you say, well, why not turn to people of other faith tradition? Well, if we already have people of other faith traditions teaching in our Catholic schools, it becomes problematic if they're engaged to teach the faith because of the very thing I explained to you. A teacher in a Catholic school isn't teaching religion as a subject alone. They should be transparently religious themselves. They should be, I had an example, some years ago, I had a priest who left the priesthood because of certain personal issues he had with the church's teachings on human sexuality. But then he had a change of heart, and after 5 years, he was very capable. He wanted to return to the priesthood. He said, mind you, I still think the church is wrong on this, and this. But when I'm teaching, I won't say that. But it was very difficult for me to see how I could return this person to ministry who said, bluntly, I don't accept the church's teaching, but I won't teach against it. What they would not be able to witness in favor of it either, because it would be inconsistent for them. So to bring in teachers of other faith traditions in subjects other than religion, which already happens and will continue to happen. In terms of religion, I think there are already some. There are some teachers in our elementary schools who are not Catholic. We have them in the Diocese of Lake. We have them in the Diocese of Lake Charles, chosen carefully because of the need to have them, and they're not allowed to continue, of course, if they in any way undermine the teachings of the church. So I think it's not necessarily impossible, but it would be challenging. It would be challenging. You don't want to impose on a teacher a burden that she or he cannot easily bear of teaching a faith with which they are not in full agreement. But we all know the world being what it is, the church being what it is today, we see all of these complicated issues of teachers in our Catholic schools who, a woman teacher who marries another woman, a man teacher who marries another man, and the bishop or the superintendent of schools or the religious order dismisses them because they're not living according to church teaching. And then the parents and the students rise up and defend the teacher who was married to another woman or to another man because they like the teacher. Well, the bishop or the principal or the superintendent isn't saying that he or she doesn't like the teacher. He's saying the teacher is presenting a witness about marriage that directly contradicts the teachings of the church. So the question is a good one, but I don't have a really satisfying answer. Yes, please.
Do I need to kneel next to this?
No. Well, they can see you.
Bishop, thanks for your remarks. I'm Tim Ewell from the Diocese of Buffalo.
Ah,
I'd like to ask you about, for those of us that like to raise some issues such as racism, we often find that people want to talk about abortion and abortion only. So how do you, because I'm sure that might have happened to you from time to time in bishops' meetings. So how do you, what kind of advice do you give us?
well, I've been to Buffalo many times. Got frozen in there in the airport. Several times. Couldn't get out. Thinking I'm just flying in for a Friday evening talk and flying out on Saturday morning, and suddenly there's 6 feet of snow. And I know a number of, and Buffalo's gone through some challenging time. You're right. Some people rightly feel that the terrible, painful tragedy in this country of legalized abortion is a great moral challenge. It needs to be faced and confronted respectfully, but forcefully. And many Catholics, for whatever reason, are much more comfortable with that topic because they feel they're being pro-life, and they certainly are, and they'd like to stay with it. Sometimes this gets you down into Republican versus Democrat. I won't go there, but we all know that sometimes is a factor. To me, if somebody is pro-life, they ought to be pro-life. The lives of everybody, It doesn't take anything away from your concern about the life of the developing human life in the womb, which of course is rightly called innocent life. But the same person, I would hope, would be pro the life of the people who are actually born. It's very interesting now that there is some talk about the new Supreme Court and the the Georgia case and the Mississippi case, that perhaps Roe v. Wade will be modified or returned to the states or overturned. I don't know what will happen there, but it's very interesting to think about the fact that if abortion were to become something for the state to decide and therefore made illegal in most states, it's mainly poor people of color who will suffer, because wealthy people can fly to Canada or fly to wherever they want to and end the life in the womb. The poor person cannot. So there's a kind of a two-edged sword there. You cannot win in most cases if you say the question of the racial divide is as important as abortion. Well, I think it is. It's human life, the dignity of every human person. Just like you can if you say capital punishment. You say you're pro-life, let's work to get all these people off death row. Many of them are innocent. And some will argue, as they have with me, yes, but Bishop, don't you think most of those guys, if they didn't do that, they did something else. They've been bad enough, they deserve to die. I hear people say, well, maybe he didn't kill that person, but looking at his track record, he probably killed somebody. So putting him to death is just getting this bad person off the street. Well, to me, that's not being pro-life. That's not being pro-life. But you cannot, and a lot of this is tied into class and social standing. In some ways, it's easier to march in front of the abortion clinic or pray the rosary in front of the abortion clinic and be against abortion than it is to be in favor of greater opportunities for people of color to get into medical school or law school or to join the fire department or the police force or to move into this neighborhood or to be involved in this parish, because those are messy things. When you get into this question of real life people who are born into the world and their rights to life, it's much more messy than the right of the developing life in the womb. And you can get, you may already have done it, some pretty thorny quarrels, and even people saying, what you're concerned about is nothing. We're talking about unborn babies, innocent babies being murdered. You're talking about people who aren't such great people anyway. So I have been through this many times, even with fellow bishops, when we talked about having in one diocese, the question came up of couldn't, with pro-life being in January, the Roe v. Wade, and the Dr. King being in January, couldn't there be one celebration at the cathedral and talk about, no. Pro-life has to be by itself because it is the preeminent moral issue. Racial prejudice is minor by comparison. I was just amazed that the bishop thought that way. To me, they could easily be put together and give equal attention. But they rightly argued in that diocese that some Catholics wouldn't come to a gathering that was pro-life, that meant pro-everybody's life. If they knew you were putting Dr. King's message with the pro-life message, they said, well, this isn't a real pro-life event. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of this is tied into the great, what's sometimes called culture wars between Republicans and Democrats, which I don't know who's going to solve. But you've asked a great question, and I've experienced it many times. So much so that I try to avoid the topic now because I know I can't win. Thank you.
Hi, Bishop. My name is Henry Fortier, and I'm the superintendent for the Diocese of Orlando, Florida. And it's not so much a question, but an appreciation of what you spoke about with the challenges you face when you enter into this topic. So 2 years ago, we began with training of our principals and leadership about impacts of racism on learning, cultural bias. And then this year, starting with the teachers, our theme for the year was Made in God's Image, trying to build a foundation from where we can all work from. And so we rolled out training on the impacts of racism in learning, cultural bias. And so, of course, in Florida, critical race theory has become a very political issue.
Oh, my, yeah.
So
Anything in Florida.
that has, so we did training for all 1,200 teachers and moving that down into the classrooms. And of course, it got to some parents and families. and then in the news, and then petitions to remove the superintendent because he's getting involved in critical race theory. And it has really exploded. Now, I'm blessed. Bishop Noonan has been very supportive of the process and trying to help parents understand we're doing Catholic social teaching, not critical race theory, and they're trying to understand the differences. But that dog whistle of CRT, anything you mention about race,
Absolutely. Suddenly critical race theory.
and it was ironic because as you were here talking, I got a text from my associate superintendent saying that the State Board of Education has stopped reimbursement for our federal funding of Title IV because they're questioning our training to the teachers on cultural bias, that it's linked to critical race and that it's been banned in the state. So it is something that we will keep doing, but the costs
Is great.
is significant.
And this will become more and more of a challenge, I fear, because we, as I mentioned in my remarks on critical race theory, which I hadn't intended to speak about, so I felt I just had to say something because it's such a challenge. We have reached a point in some circles where it's a wedge issue, so that if you mention anything about race, racial justice, you're a proponent of critical race theory. So that's a great wedge to silence people, not wanting to be cut down, not wanting to be attacked. You can't say anything, love God and love your neighbors, but all you can say. As soon as you say, wasn't this incident with the police and this person of color, wasn't that something we should think about and pray about? Oh, no, that's critical race theory. Anything you say would be judged as critical race theory, which is a way of silencing. Silencing, as I said in the end, while we may not bring the words ourselves into the public forum, that doesn't excuse us from our commitment and responsibility as Catholics to speak clearly about justice that Christ himself has taught. You can't allow the thought police to prevent you from consistently proclaiming the dignity and value of every human being. So thank you for sharing that.
So, Bishop, we have a question from one of our friends joining us online. This is from Claire Kilbane, and her question is this: as part of last year's Catholic Leadership Summit, Bishop Wilton Gregory did a keynote during which he indicated that he rarely meets African American graduates of Catholic schools who have been invited to become Catholic during their time there. The implication was that if a school doesn't issue an invitation to an African American student, they might feel that they are unwelcome in the faith. But if a school does invite a student, it may appear to be proselytizing. Do you have any advice about the right way to issue an invitation?
Well, I think that in the Acts of the Apostles, you see the words, you see those Christians, you see how they love one another. Invitation can, first of all, be issued by example, by living out the Christian life in such a way that maybe the students will say themselves, I'd like to be what he is or what she is. Now, the simple truth is that many people of color who may go to Catholic schools, especially at the graduate level, already have a faith tradition. They are already committed African Methodist Episcopalian. They're already committed Baptist. They're already committed Jehovah's Witnesses. People have a long memory. The church has a long history of exclusion, is not forgotten. So the lack of welcome and invitation over generations has led to a presumption that they won't be welcome. And of course, more and more of our young African American men, particularly if they are interested in religion at all, it's more likely Islam. Because Islam has such a strong voice for the dignity of people in their own culture, in their own racial situation, and certainly anyone who might be incarcerated, they'll be given an exposure to Islam. I don't think there's anything wrong with approaching someone and saying, we're so happy you're in our Catholic school. Have you ever thought about becoming a Catholic? It's a matter of how you do it. You can't be coercive. You can't be pressured. You can't be, to stay here, you ought to be a Catholic, or don't you know we're right and you're wrong. But to issue an invitation in the right setting, often it's best done on a one-on-one basis. That would be certainly possible. But I think right now, so many people are alienated from mainline institutional religion, period, particularly younger people, no matter what their background might be. We hear all the time, oh, Bishop, I'm a very spiritual person, but I'm not religious. I'm not into religion. I like to go hiking in the woods and the trees and the flowers. And I find God there, which everybody can. But they find institutional religion somewhat open, especially, of course, on the hard issues. The hard issues that we all know about, whether it's abortion, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's euthanasia, whether it's same-sex marriage, all of these issues on which the Catholic Church has a clear teaching that goes against the tide. Most people in most Christian religions have taken a different stance. And so many people that I know who like the church and like the music and like the preaching and like the fellowship say, well, I wouldn't become a Catholic because I can't accept your teaching on this or your teaching on that. It's interesting, and then other Catholics who are very involved in their parishes, and they don't accept those teachings either. They've just found their way to saying, well, I'm a Catholic, I'm going to stay a Catholic, and I'm right, the church is wrong, and I'm just going to live with the tension. But we shouldn't be embarrassed to invite people, but always with the sensitivity to where they might be coming from, and to the fact that they may already have a spiritual home and be very happy with it, and we can't pressure them out of that spiritual home into joining the Catholic Church. It's a great question, though. It's a great question.
Thank you, Bishop. And we have another question from a friend online. It's from Michelle Leah, and joining us from Chicago.
My hometown.
How do we emphasize to our fellow Catholics that this is a Catholic issue, not a conservative or a liberal issue?
Good luck. Well, in the end, if a person really looks at the human condition and what we are as human beings, it's not only Catholic, it's a human issue. It's not a liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. I almost made mention about the pandemic and masks and vaccines, but I know better. So it's the human condition. The human condition invites us to see that every other person in the world is another version of what they are, no matter what. Every other walking human being, or even those who cannot walk, is another version of what they are. And because they are another version of what you are, your concern for, and your welcome of, and your love for, and your protection of, and your solicitousness for should be real. I don't accept an argument that overcoming the racial divide is something for Democrats and ending abortion is something for Republicans. I think that's just a bizarre dichotomy. I think something that I left out of this presentation when I was talking about Black Lives Matter, I left out a whole section on the fact that if Black lives really matter to proponents of Black Lives Matter, that means the Black lives of young African American men whose lives are taken by other African American men, those lives matter. And sadly, the number of developing African American lives in the womb that are ended by abortion, those lives matter too. You get into a quarrel about that when you talk to people who are proponents of the Black Lives Matter movement, but I simply deleted it just because of time limitations. But it's really, to me, it's a question of recognizing the human condition, that every single human being in the world, of whatever religion, race, nationality, economic, social circumstance, is another version of you, and you want them to be cared for and welcomed the way you want to be cared for and welcomed. I feel very strongly about that. I appreciate all these questions.
Thank you, Bishop. John Galvan, Diocese of San Diego.
Beautiful San Diego.
Yes, beautiful San Diego, beautiful Utah.
Beautiful. Great this morning.
It was lovely. I think we can all agree you've inspired us this morning. Thank you very much. This is an area that we've been trying to tackle in San Diego, much like Orlando. We've worked with our principals, opening up their minds and their hearts in very challenging ways to address this issue. You said two things that very much resonated with me. One is our charge in Catholic education is to inform, form, and transform in the person of Jesus Christ. That's our mission. But you also said that this isn't a program to be implemented. And I can speak for myself and maybe some others, that's where I'm stuck. So as you know, maybe as a parting practical first step, an action item that we can take with us in lieu of a program or something that's, you know, that's fully controlled, what can we do?
Well, it sounds like you're already doing some good things. I certainly want you to continue and to build on. When I say it's not a program, it doesn't mean you can't make use of various programs as a resource, as a help. But in the end, some things that we talk about, like conversion of heart, if there is no interior, if you have a teacher or principal who deep down is prejudiced in an extreme way, unless he or she or superintendent or pastor or parish priest or whatever they have, if they actually hold biases and prejudices against this group or that group, without a conversion of heart, they're not going to be very effective in forming and transforming in Christ. I had a whole section which I also left out on different forms of conversion, and conversion is the work of the Holy Spirit, but it's supported by the example of others. And so that I think that those schools where there's regular prayer for the faculty is a very important thing, where faculty periodically can take a day in the desert or a day of reflection or a day of retreat, so they can focus on their interiority, and not just in a general sense of walking around the grounds of a beautiful retreat house praying the rosary, but talking about how does my faith illuminate my attitude towards women, towards the elderly, towards children, towards people of different races, of different sexual orientation, because you can be going on a day of reflection and just reinforce your kind of simple, personal, selfish, spiritual ideas and not bring the gospel to bear on the morning's newspaper. What am I doing that is hindering the advance of the gospel? And that's where, because without a conversion of heart, I don't think it's possible. I really don't.
Yeah. Well, it's ironic that the symbol of our hope and our faith is the cross. And I just want to say you are loved.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't always think that's so, but I appreciate it.
And then we had just one more question, Bishop, and we want to be respectful of your time, that we can continue if you're enjoying the conversation.
Where's my room, Sarah? I need to leave at a quarter to, I have time, because my flight's 2:45. So I sometimes do other things that you need to do though. So I'll take another question.
So many of our school leaders are very stressed by doing their best to take on this issue. And I know of one school leader that actually took a leave of absence, and she felt like the more she tried to sincerely confront the question of the racial divide within her school community, the more emotion it elicited, and the stress became overwhelming for her. And so I think just in terms of practical prayer advice or meditative advice for us and for our teams, what is a prayer or reflection or something that we could offer to our school leaders that are really living the stress of trying to address these challenges in a Christian spirit?
Well, there's no question about that. But to me, the paramount thing is personal support. Other people on the faculty, fellow teachers, fellow principals, the same issue of our parish priests. We shouldn't walk along feeling like we're all alone in this. Support other people. When you ask someone in the morning, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm fine. And well, I'm fine too. That's really not a true exchange. The person asking, how are you? They're expecting, I'm fine. And when they say, how are you? They're expecting you to say, I'm fine. But sometimes we should ask, genuinely, I'm wondering, how are you doing today? And give the person a chance to tell you how they're doing. Because personal support is critical. If you're on the cutting edge of a challenging issue like the racial divide, having a support group or a group of friends that you can talk about this and speak very openly and honestly about the tension that you're feeling, the exhaustion, which leads to wanting to take time off, which I certainly understand, is a help. I find in the writings of someone like the great Thomas Merton, the Trappist mystic, he has many books on the interior life that are very helpful. His life ended many years ago in 1968. I used to see him when I would go to Gethsemane in Kentucky. some of his writings are very helpful for me. And there are some people find the writings of Father Richard Rohr helpful in this regard. But to me, a support group, I think one of the things that our priests need more than anything else is other priests with whom they can be at ease and talk and share what they're going through, because many of our priests are growing older and he has to take 1, 2, or 3 parishes and not enough money, not enough volunteers, so the stress gets to them. And I encourage them to develop support groups, people that you can really be with. So everybody won't be a support group. Sometimes a support group may be only 2 or 3 people, 4 people at most. But you need to have people who have empathy. A section that where I left out some of the suggestions. Key to this whole process is empathy. Can you feel with others? To ask students, how do you feel about what you see in the paper about race? Are you sympathetic to people who are experiencing? How did you feel about the George Floyd situation? How do you feel about what happened here or there? Empathy is key for the support. But to me, critical is not giving up. And I think, again, back to Mother Teresa, where I visited with a number of times, speaking engagement in Sydney, Australia, one years ago, we were together for several days. This tiny little diminutive, language, 4 feet 8 or whatever, not giving up. They're taking on the whole world of India, which is so complex. And not a Catholic country. And this was a group band of 10 sisters with their pails and buckets and their towels, walking around, nursing wounds of these dying men and women on the streets, being told you're accomplishing nothing. You're not even touching 1/100th of 1%, but not giving up. That, I think the same we hear, to have the inner confidence, especially in prayer, especially in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, of not giving up and with the support of others. But there's no question, it's not easy. There is no question. There's some good reading, like Thomas, where everybody has to find their own reading. I find Merton very helpful. Others find Richard Rohr, and there are others too, depending on one's perspective and one's point of view. But don't give up. Don't give up. Let me ask you a question. Of the things that I talked about, like the difference between the racial divide and racism and minority groups as a term that is not neutral, but a politicized language, or Afrocentric religious art in Catholic churches, or anything else. What did you find helpful or thought-provoking? What did you find that particularly significant? Yes, please.
Bishop, I would just say on that point, the first thing I thought of when you said that was, I'm Joe Borbach from Arlington, Virginia, was the admissions, the tuition, the way we break out tuition. And that seemed like something that should have been thought about before, and that would be easy for us to take a closer look at. And, the challenge you posed of not having it, identifying people by what they are not, but what they are. That was an immediate good challenge to me.
It's so simple to do. Why would you say we want to make sure we have 4% minority students in our school? Why? I mean, are there so many that you can't name the groups you're talking about? Who are those people in your community who you would like to have call them what they are?
And even the way we tell them what the tuition is to break it out that way.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I'm happy to hear that. Anything else?
It was the exact same thing that
Oh.
you just mentioned.
Go ahead.
We have, parishioners and non-parishioners for tuition, as well as we say we have Catholics and
Non-Catholic. I cannot stand the phrase non-Catholic. I mean, have you ever been called a non-Presbyterian? Non-Lutheran? Why not? And even our neighbors who are Protestant traditions, they call themselves non-Catholics. I have several Jewish friends in New York. Well, Bishop, as a non-Catholic, I really like your Pope. As a what? As a non-Catholic? Yeah, I'm a non-Catholic. You know I'm Jewish. Well, you're not a non-Catholic. You are Jewish. What does it mean to be a non-Catholic? Like, do you name yourself because of what you're not? Should men say as a non-woman, and should women say as a non-man? we don't affirm ourselves as what we are. You else find something that I shared interesting or thought-provoking? Yes.
I love Matthew Gorda San Diego. I loved how you affirmed this idea that we shouldn't be teaching critical race theory down, but it's critical to teach race.
Exactly.
That it is part of our calling in our Catholic social teachings to do that. And that affirmation just is motivation along the pathway for us, at least, if nothing else. So thank you
So
for
you
that.
cannot allow people who are policing you to say, if you raise the question of do you know how many people cannot get a good education in this country because of the cost, and how many of those are poor people of color? Why are you teaching critical race? You're just asking a question. So that if somebody says, oh, if everything that you mentioned is critical race theory, then you'd only be allowing them to gain a football by saying, oh, so let's talk about the weather. I can't mention anything because it's all critical race theory. I mean, the same is true of the issue of women. Oh, you're often that feminist business. Well, you can be talking about the legitimate concerns of women in this country, of which there are many, and they're not simple and they're complex. But you're not off on some feminist thing. You're talking about a concrete social reality. The maldistributed health, something like equal pay for equal work. Well, why are we still not there? That's not radical feminism. That's justice. To me, and yet we still aren't there.
Well, Bishop, if we could then perhaps just offer a final note of gratitude to you for taking the time to come all the way to us. Bishop's book, The Church and the Racial Divide, is available on the Kindle store. I would really encourage it. He writes at length about a lot of the themes he introduced. Most importantly, he does offer that note of Christian hope throughout. So, Bishop, we could perhaps ask your blessing as we go forth to support our schools in this important
Well,
time.
again, I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you for being attentive for somewhat long, complex reflections. When someone first said, would you come and talk for about 45 minutes and answer questions for 15 minutes, I came all the way to Salt Lake City. First, I thought that we're doing nonstop flights. I usually determine whether I will go someplace by. Is there a nonstop flight? Happily, I thought there were nonstop flight. I said I came to just to touch the surface of the things I'm concerned with. I need at least an hour, so thank you for patiently listening. We have a long way to go. Catholic Church has a long way to go. The country has a long way to go, and my own road has not been an easy one. If I would tell you the story of what my parents experienced as Catholics in Chicago at the ends of the church, you would be amazed. If I would tell you what I experienced in the seminary, you would be amazed. And I would tell you what I've experienced as a member of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I think you would be amazed. That's why I don't talk about those things. Let me leave you with these words from the great Anglican divine John his meditations he wrote. Wilt thou love God as God loves thee? Then digest, dear soul, this wholesome meditation. Was much that man was made like God before, but that God is made like man much more. The Lord be with you. Bow down your heads and pray for God's blessings. Pray that the Lord will bless each one of you, your family members, your principals, your teachers, your parents, and your students. Pray that the Holy Spirit will renew your strength to may persevere in the great and critical ministry Christian education, remembering that you are called to guide our young people so they can be informed, formed, and transformed in Christ. May you never tire of God's grace, helping people to learn their faith, love their faith, and to live their faith. May you be equipped with all the resources that you need to honestly and forthrightly face and address the terrible wound of the racial divide in our country and in our church. Blessed be the name of the Lord, both now and forever. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. And may the blessings of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit descend upon all of you, and those who are dear to you, and remain with you forever. Be at peace. Thank you.